Hi there, it's me again, your favorite history professor. Well, I mean, come on, how many of them do you have? Okay, your third favorite history professor? How about ninth favorite? At any rate, today our subject is, as you can see, the Americas in the Age of Independence, a unit which corresponds with a chapter of that exact name. We will look at the history of the United States in the 19th century. A great deal of it will be about expansion to the west, though not all. Then we will move north and look at the developments in the same period in Canada, which was first a French colony centuries back, then a British colony, and in the latter half of this 19th century, they achieved independence without a war from Great Britain. And then we'll move finally south to look at Latin America and kind of the results of all of the revolutions we saw in Latin America in an earlier unit. So let's begin, shall we? We'll first take a look at the American West and westward expansion. America's rise to power and wealth during this period, the 19th century and early 20th century, is explainable in large part, not completely, by westward expansion. America became a much bigger country with more resources, larger population size as it expanded westward. And as you probably already know, sadly, tragically, and we'll talk about this, much of this expansion happened at the expense of other peoples, Native Americans and Mexicans primarily, other European powers also. So westward expansion is something that gets a lot of attention in American society. It's kind of part of our popular culture. Lots of movies and television shows and books about the West. It's had sort of a certain romance and mythical appeal for a long time. But we're trying to sort of sort out the myth from the reality here. And there's no doubt that the westward expansion of the country is of great significance for the reasons I've just mentioned and beyond. A relatively recent book on the history of the West says, whatever its boundaries, the West has always been partly understood through the process of getting there and the process of changing frontiers that keep redefining themselves even today. That may make the Western story more complicated, but it also makes it more interesting and more relevant. The history of the frontier is a unifying American theme. For every part of the country was once a frontier, every region was once a West, which is actually true. If this was an American history class, U.S. history, you would find, and maybe you've already taken such a class, that if you go back to the early colonies in the 17th century, that if you go sort of to Western Virginia, went a little bit further to Kentucky or Tennessee, that was the West at one time. Even in our class here, we'll talk about Abraham Lincoln later in this lecture, who made his political career and life in Illinois, a little further west than that, but that's the Midwest today. But that was considered the Western frontier at the time. So what counts as the American West depends on how far the frontier has advanced at any one time. We'll also get to the sectional crisis, the crisis between North and South leading to the Civil War, and much of that plays out over westward expansion. During this sectional crisis, the West became really kind of the gigantic battlefield where the frontline conflicts over slavery took place. I mean, before the Civil War, I'm talking about political conflicts, although there's some violence in there as well. Manifest destiny, a phrase you're perhaps familiar with, coined by the Irish-American journalist of the period, John O'Sullivan, from the New York Morning News in 1844. I've just picked out the famous snippet here. It is our manifest destiny to overspread the continent. So the phrase ever since has come to it's been associated with the West ever since, and O'Sullivan was certainly not the only one using this concept. Others began to use the phrase eventually as well, but the concept pre-existed the phrase. The concept was that the U.S. and the American people not only can move to the West, they should, and they kind of have a God-given right. That was the belief. Manifest destiny. The destiny has always had sort of a religious connotation to it, that God wants us to have this land. Quoting from Hine again, he says, manifest destiny was not, as historians so often imply, a deeply held American folk belief. Rather, it was the self-conscious creation of political propagandists like O'Sullivan, the guy who coined the phrase, determined to uncouple the politics of expansion from the growing sectional controversy over slavery. I don't totally agree with the quote, though he could be right. I don't totally agree with the second quote that I'll read momentarily either. He's basically saying that Manifest Destiny was sort of a phony creation from the press and from political leaders in the country to make the West and American expansion look, to kind of make it look less ugly than it actually was. And again, there's some truth to it, but I also think that whether they should have or not, a lot of Americans believed in the concept of manifest destiny. They believed, and there's maybe they shouldn't have because there's a certain arrogance, maybe even a prejudice behind it. But a lot of Americans, I do think, came to believe that Americans themselves had the right, as individuals and as a people, to take this land from others, because they believed they would sort of make more of it and it would benefit even those who they were taking the land from. As hard as that is to believe, there were Americans that believed this. As unrealistic as it might have been, and again, prejudiced as it might have been, there were many who seem to have believed it. So in that sense, I don't necessarily agree with the quote in full. A historian called Wilfred Maclay, that's written a book about American history in general of recent origin, also says, today, when we hear the term manifest destiny, our reaction is likely to be guarded. We may take it to be an expression of arrogance, a florid way of saying, step aside, we're taking over. And that reaction is not entirely wrong or unwarranted. But it is important to realize that O'Sullivan himself, again, the journalist quoted above, and the Young America movement, of which he was a part, did not envision this destiny merely as an imperialistic land acquisition project. His vision was far more idealistic than that, a vision that had sprung from the spirit of Jacksonian democracy, but that recalled dreams of previous generations of America as a land of hope. So O'Sullivan is sort of saying, as I just did, that many Americans did believe in the concept, whether they should have or not, and it sort of gave them an idealistic vision, as it says, about not just taking land for economic purposes and purposes of power, but that it had sort of some sort of larger, even spiritual significance to what was being done. American settlers and pioneers during the first half of the 19th century began to move west, some of them permanently, right, on the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, etc. And this was dangerous business, as you probably already know. California, there was the Donner Party that didn't make it all the way through the mountains, the Sierras, and most of them perished in a very, very difficult situation, to put it mildly. So it was no easy thing. There was a lot of sacrifice, a lot of time, not just dangerous, but tiring, and lots of dirt and grime, all kinds of issues. But many Americans were looking for new opportunities, seeking the American dream, as it eventually became known, and thought they could find it west. This is one of the significant features of the West in the American psyche, in the American mind, even today, and that is the West has always been seen as, America is seen as a land of opportunity anyway throughout its history, but the West is even kind of a more concentrated version of it. Go west and sort of chase your dreams and seek and try to realize opportunity. So many Americans believed this, however true or untrue it was, and the manifest destiny concept kind of helped give them more inclination to do so. It added an idealistic sort of tone to the whole thing. One organizer for organizing these migratory efforts by various groups of Americans, it says they do say that out in Oregon, the pigs are running around under great acorn trees, round and fat, and already cooked, with knives and forks sticking in them, so you can cut off a slice wherever you're hungry. Surely he meant that somewhat as a joke, but keep in mind he was trying to sell people on how wonderful it was to move out to the West. Robert Hine, yet again, telling us, asking us, how do historians explain the overland migration to the Pacific, one of the most remarkable of many remarkable incidents of the epic of the American West? It resulted from a convergence of circumstances. And among those circumstances that converged, he deals with a mania for land speculation. So lots of people came to acquire land. And this is partly where we get into conflict with Native Americans and Mexico. More on that later. There was an economic panic and crisis in 1837, which brought land prices way down. So on the heels of that, there's even more incentive to move to the West. There were plenty of Americans during this period, but prior to the Civil War, whose dislike of slavery, depending on where they lived, caused them to move to the West. Although it wasn't a sure thing that slavery would be kept out of the Western territories and Western states, that was still to be fought over in the sectional crisis. A lot of them believed that the plains states were barren. In some ways they were, although later many of those states and areas in those states became agricultural heartland territory. But many people thought the best place to go to make a living and to live was the West Coast, California, Oregon, etc. There was rumors of abundance, meaning kind of the typical mythical, hey, if you come out here or go over there, things will be way better. There's an element of the grass is always greener mentality to westward expansion throughout our history. So it gets back to kind of the mythical part of it. And there was always the pull of the unknown, right? To most Americans living in, say, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, they just sort of heard stories or read newspaper articles or books about the West, and often was embellished with a certain romantic flair, as I've already said. And it sounded wonderful. It sounded exciting. It sounded adventurous. It sounded like a place you could make a new start for yourself. But part of the appeal was that it was unknown. What's appealing about the unknown? Well, it's unknown. No, it's the known becomes what we experience on an everyday basis. That becomes kind of humdrum, and we get so used to it that even if we have a wonderful life, it can kind of get a little bit stale because we already know what to expect every day. But if you're thinking about, say, the West as something you've just heard a little bit about, your imagination can fill in the rest. And our imaginations, unfortunately, for human beings, not unfortunately in every way, are limitless. So what tends to happen, sadly, is that anything that builds up on our imagination for long enough can never really be satisfied with reality. Meaning the imagination, the imagined part of it becomes so large that the reality, if it ever comes to that, can't ever live up to it. So that people dreamed about going to the West for months or years, and finally got their chance and were so excited, and then got there and said, "Oh, this is it." Oh, okay. Not that it was necessarily horrible. Plenty of Americans were glad on the other side that they had moved, and many became prosperous and successful, and did live out the American dream. But not everybody, and there were plenty who did at some point come to a conflict between what they had expected and what they got, imagination and reality. Also, as part of this stage in American history comes Indian removal and the Trail of Tears. Now, there were many conflicts with Native Americans throughout the process of westward expansion, so this is just one of them, but this is probably the biggest one with the greatest historical significance. Indian removal and the Trail of Tears. I'll start with our usual quote from Professor Bentley and Ziegler, Professors Bentley and Ziegler, with the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which means Congress passed a bill, President Jackson signed it into law. The United States government determined to move all Native Americans west of the Mississippi River and into Indian Territory. The affected tribes were the Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw. You can see their ancestral lands, or where they were currently living, in dark green. Seminoles in Florida, Cherokee and Creek basically west of Georgia into Alabama, and the other two tribes in what's today mostly Mississippi. So this really was the forced movement of the tribes of the American Southeast. The state of Georgia had settlers constantly kind of flowing across the border into Cherokee and Creek territory, even if and when the government tried to stop them, and it didn't always try to stop them, either the Georgia government as a state government or the U.S. government in Washington, D.C., and this became an increasing problem on both sides. So in the end, after all kinds of other attempts to get the 5 civilized tribes, as they were sometimes called, which was an insult, among other things, it implies that the other Native American tribes were uncivilized. But even the definition of civilized in that phrase was based on white American standards, not Native American standards. So there were all kinds of attempts to negotiate with Native Americans. They were sometimes swindled and cheated into signing treaties, or signatures were forged, etc. So a lot of untoward stuff on the part of, again, state governments and the U.S. government. And in the end, when none of that worked, at least in getting most or all Native Americans to leave, some agreed to under one particular deal or another. But in the end, those that stayed were forced out at gunpoint in what's known as the Trail of Tears. That phrase, Trail of Tears, usually is applied specifically to the march of Cherokee peoples out to Indian Territory, which is basically modern-day Oklahoma, already set aside for them there. But the Trail of Tears can be used, and sometimes is, to refer to the forced marches of all of the 5 tribes. And with the little lines, green and yellow and such, you can see the route of the movement. And the marches themselves were brutal. They weren't intentionally killing people. Probably happened in a few cases, but just the conditions were awful. Sometimes freezing cold and not enough food and blankets and medicine for Native Americans. So by today's standards, it'd probably be considered a war crime. Even though it was not during a war at that particular point. But this is not surprisingly, one of the more ugly episodes in American history, the forced removal of 5 major tribes against their will out to Indian Territory. So these kind of cruelties abound in the history of Native American relations. Sadly, as I always have to say. But there's kind of a double evil in all of this, and that is that one of the main reasons that these tribes were moved is because right around this same time, or a little bit before, that particular part of America, the American Deep South, was now really the world's center for growing what could be seen as the world's #1 most important commodity at the time, cotton. And there was a lot of prime cotton land in those 2 green areas, the 2 above Florida. And so in order to plant more cotton on American soil, Native Americans were moved to Oklahoma so settlers, farmers, plantation owners could come in. And of course, you already guessed it, but the double evil is what that meant then was an expansion of slavery. More slaves were necessary, once there are more cotton plantations and more land under cotton cultivation. You can see that area is in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, a little bit in Tennessee, all of which were slave states at the time. So the Indian removal that we're talking about here was incredible cruelty to Native Americans, and by extension, increased and expanded the cruelty of American slavery. Looking even further into America and its westward expansion, we see relations with Native Americans kind of deteriorate on all fronts. Although there were attempts to, again, sort of bring a meeting of the minds. One was the Fort Laramie Treaty, which you see here, signed in 1868. So this had something to do with a trail, a road that the U.S. is building, the Bozeman Trail. And there's actually a couple of Fort Laramie treaties. But this is a good example of the almost inevitable types of conflicts that came up as American settlers and the U.S. government kind of trying to assist them moved further and further west and encroached on Native American lands time and time again. Native Americans didn't like roads being built through their lands or railroads for various reasons. One of them was that sometimes they built roads over sacred ground, burial grounds, cemeteries where ancestors were buried, and things of this nature. So Red Cloud, the most powerful Native American chief to sign the treaty and negotiating with the Civil War hero William Tecumseh Sherman, photograph of them in the tent together there during the negotiations of the treaty. Red Cloud said, "Think of it, I, who used to own country so extensive that I could not ride through it in a week, must tell Washington when I'm hungry I must beg for that which I own," because part of this deal had to do with the setting aside of territory on reservation land for Native Americans. We've already seen when we looked at the Indian removal of last slide that was already part of the thinking and policy of the U.S., and that only continued here. 1868 is the other side of the Civil War. So this is a number of decades after Indian removal, but some of the same issues still exist. And the Treaty of Fort Laramie, as is so often true of treaties between the U.S. government and Native Americans, got violated by the U.S. It didn't take that long either. Native Americans were split over what to do about constant and increasing American migration into their own lands. Red Cloud, who I just mentioned, who negotiated the treaty, thought that the pragmatic move was to make a deal. And that's what he was trying to do in the treaty. And there was practicality, a certain pragmatism to this, because Red Cloud can be seen to be thinking and saying, in part, if we fight for this, we're going to lose. We'll lose everything. If we make a deal and sign a treaty, we'll at least get something out of it. We're making a deal. But if we fight and lose, we're likely to lose everything. So better to get something than risk all or nothing and get nothing. But two of the most famous leaders, Sioux chiefs, were dead set opposed to the treaty all the way around. Crazy Horse, he on the left. I'm on the right side of the screen, but the gentleman further to the left, and then Sitting Bull to the right side of the screen, who talked about not wanting their peoples penned in to reservation lands, and both of them believed that the honorable thing to do is to resist by force, whether they win or lose. Sitting Bull, and I don't know if he actually, I'm sorry, Crazy Horse, who was actually a warrior, a leader of warriors in battle, is supposed to have said, "It's a good day to fight. It's a good day to die," meaning I'd rather die than see our land taken over by the Americans who are stealing it from us. So who was right? Red Cloud wanting to make a pragmatic deal and doing so, or Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull who wanted no compromise whatsoever, at least at that time. It's hard to say. You can make a case for both. So the Indian Wars, about 30 years long, they were being fought every single year between 1860 and 1890, saw conflict occurring throughout much of the West. All those little purple dots or splotches on there are battle sites. So there were battles as far away as Arizona, and on the other side in Minnesota, South Dakota, Montana, the Colorado, etc., the Dakotas. So this was warfare over a large piece of territory, which also shows you how extensive American incursion on Native American lands was. Meaning there's settlers everywhere in all these places that are infringing on Native Americans' own lands. So this set of wars, really series of wars in 30 years, was kind of Native America's last bid for independence, and really their last bid to kind of maintain their own way of life without being subsumed by the U.S. And there were a number of different wars. Sometimes there's a number of wars with, by even one group. The Comanche, a very feared Native American group. They're kind of center of operations, really kind of Texas, Oklahoma area. Sometimes they even went south into Mexico. The Comanche had their heyday earlier, so they were even more powerful before this, but they were still a force. So, as it says on the screen, the once great Comancheria Empire from Canada to Mexico, built on trade of guns, horses, hides, captives, was now down to just several thousand people. But again, still formidable. They were great fighters, and everyone was afraid to fight them. Fellow Native Americans, American citizens, Mexican citizens, everyone was terrified by the Comanche. They still had the power, the skill to violently raid settlers' farms, places like West Texas and beyond. William Tecumseh Sherman, who we saw in the tent negotiating with Red Cloud over the treaty, became the treaty that we talked about, Fort Laramie Treaty. He was the American general in charge of the West, dispatched 3,000 troops to the area in 1871. About 6 years after the Civil War ended, to deal with the Comanche, which basically meant get them out of the way. He used the same kind of slash and burn techniques that he used infamously in the Civil War when he did his March to the Sea, where he went to the state of Georgia and just ripped it apart. This was when the North was fighting South, so the people of Georgia and the armies there were Confederate armies. Sherman worked for the U.S. government and was fighting eventually a winning campaign against the Confederacy. But he went and tore Georgia apart, and he did something similar to the Comanche. And as it says at the very bottom, with little left to survive, the remaining Comanche reluctantly agreed to live on reservation land, which is incredible, considering how fearsome this group was, how fiercely independent they were, and how good they were at maintaining their independence for so long. And they weren't just independent before this. They carved out their own empire in this region. They called the shots, and they overtook other people, not the other way around. So this was a real turnaround by the time they're put out of business and agreed to go on to reservation land. Connor Parker, who you see there, who was part Native American and part white, was sort of one of the influential leaders during the period, maybe the most influential leader. The Nez Perce War of 1877 is another good example of all of the themes sort of we've touched on here. The U.S. dictated a treaty that took most of the Nez Perce land, that's a tribe, Most leaders refused to move to the reservation, so much like what happened with the Cherokee and Choctaw Creek, some of them moved, some of them didn't. But the Army issued an ultimatum in 1877: come into the reservation or be tracked down. Approximately 800 Nez Perce, under their gifted and charismatic leader, Chief Joseph, who you see pictured on the left, trekked through Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana to get to Canada. Native Americans generally fared better, or basically left alone by the government in Canada, mainly under British control and independent of Great Britain. But Chief Joseph and his band of 800, tragically, after marching with troops behind them and having to stop and fight battles from time to time, or firefights here and there, were stopped 50 miles from the Canadian border. So they came within 50 miles of getting to what they would have thought of or did think of as freedom. After a 5-day siege, and they were sort of finally caught 50 miles south of the Canadian border, Chief Joseph surrendered. In his reported speech, he supposedly said, these are now famous words, "I'm tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. It is cold and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." A heartbreaking moment in Native American history. Unfortunately, there are too many of these. Then around the same time came the Sioux War, 1876, 1877. And it's this one, I think, that really, once it's over, marks sort of the last gasp of independence from Native Americans. One leader saying, "Wherever we went, the soldiers came to kill us." This war came about, as so many of them did, over resources. Gold was discovered in the Black Hills of the Dakotas, which led the government to violate the treaty, the deal with Red Cloud, the Fort Laramie Treaty, as miners streamed into the area, not recognizing the treaty. Part of the problem is, even when the U.S. government was trying to enforce treaties that benefited, or to some degree benefited, Native Americans, American citizens just ignored the treaties much of the time and went on their own, putting the government in an awkward, difficult position. Not that the U.S. government doesn't share a lot of the blame for much of this, but the settlers certainly didn't help, to put it mildly. In 1876, the U.S. military or army launched a three-pronged attack led by officers, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, who became famous, as you may know, General George Crook, and Colonel John Gibbon. So there were kind of three separate forces moving in kind of different areas, and they were basically kind of supposed to converge at one point. Crazy Horse, we already met, and his warriors defeated Crook at the Battle of Rosebud, which is on the map there. Custer famously divided his troops. It was a small one regiment. So these aren't huge battles, by the way, at least not by Civil War, American Revolutionary War standards, world standards at the time. But Custer's regiment was divided under Custer's orders, and the attack that Custer, if you can call it that, came up with, failed miserably. Part of the problem was that Custer hadn't done much reconnaissance and greatly underestimated the size of the Native American force they'd be up against on the day of the famous battle. In 1877, Crazy Horse was captured and killed. In 1881, Sitting Bull surrendered while being taken into custody and was actually shot while being arrested. So I'm sorry, he surrendered in 1881. 9 years later, he was subject to arrest for something that really he wasn't a part of, but was arrested anyway. And one of those sent to arrest him, who oddly enough was a Native American interpreter in the employment of the federal government, who for some reason, while they were arresting him, shot Sitting Bull. And this, of course, was alarming to not just fellow Sioux, but by that time, Sitting Bull was famous throughout the country and was respected even by other Native American tribes. The battle I mentioned that Custer is famous for is the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which you see here, or Custer's Last Stand, as it's sometimes more commonly known. Custer was quite a person. You can see him there on the left. He had lots of ambition. He'd been a very young cavalry officer in the Civil War, fought gallantly there, but he loved kind of the big stage. He loved the limelight, and he was very ambitious. According to Professor Rourke in his textbook, he said Custer's military record, his theatrical good looks, he had sort of those long sort of locks of hair, which you don't see really there, but sometimes it was apparently longer than that, made him a favorite of the press. The dashing colonel commanded the nation's attention. So this is a guy that wasn't that high ranking. He was only a colonel at the height or the end of his career, but he was becoming increasingly famous. The press liked him. Custer's Last Stand was a battle that really lasted less than a half an hour, with Custer and 225 of his men dying alongside him. The Sioux leaders that basically surrounded his group of guys on a hill and struck them, cut them all down eventually, were actually impressed by the guy they called Yellow Hair, Custer. One of them saying they kept in order and fought like brave warriors as long as they had a man left, which was a compliment to Custer as well as his men, because Custer was sort of in command of them. But Custer's Last Stand was a victory for the Native Americans here, but all it did really was anger American leaders, both political and military, even more. And now there are more troops and on the back end of this, and sort of more effort being made to defeat Native Americans in this war, move them off their lands, partly now out of revenge for Custer's Last Stand, or the Battle of the Little Bighorn. We can see signs of clear desperation on the part of Native Americans as a whole, as they're losing their land, losing control over their cultures during the latter half of the 19th century here. The ghost dance and ghost dance religion is a great, maybe the best example of this. A Native American leader in what's now Nevada, called Wovoka, who actually had an Anglo name as well, Jack Wilson, and I'm reading directly from my own PowerPoint here, of course, preached a new religion which included sort of dancing. Native American religions sometimes included rain dances and things like this. So if certain ceremonial dances and rituals were done according to belief, and this was a new religion, though it had some features of old Native American worship and religious practice, in time, dead relatives killed by the white man would return, as would the buffalo, who had basically been made extinct by this time through over-hunting, sometimes deliberate on the part of whites, and the whites themselves would disappear. So the belief was, if you practice the religion the right way, did the dances the correct way, were committed to it, in time, this would somehow magically cause Native American or dead relatives to reappear, the white people to disappear, and the buffalo to kind of come back from the grave themselves. Many chiefs from different tribes heard about this, and some of them going all the way to Nevada from distant locations to hear Wovoka, the leader of this religion, its creator, speak, and then came back to their own peoples, usually kind of fired up about the ghost dance. It's spread like wildfire across the Great Plains, getting all the way to Sitting Bull's reservation before he was murdered while being arrested at Standing Rock Reservation in the Black Hills. So the Black Hills of Dakota are far away from Nevada, but the news and ideas about the knowledge of the ghost dance spread quickly, and Native Americans were sort of doing the ghost dance, practicing their religion all over the place. And it does have all of the, I think, markers of desperation here. Sitting Bull himself knew that no magic was going to happen by dancing and wearing ghost shirts, as they called them, wearing certain things. And that there was a belief he wore the ghost shirts that U.S. cavalry soldiers' bullets would bounce off of them. He knew better. Sitting Bull knew better than this, but he didn't try to stop his people on the reservation, probably partly because he recognized that this is desperation. They've lost like all hope. And so this at least gives them, even if it's fake, false hope, this gives them something, at least for a time, to be able to hold on to. So a tragic moment in American and Native American history, for sure. So why was this religion so popular? Well, we've already really answered that. Because of the desperation of Native Americans' situation, about to lose all of their land, and about to lose really their independence and independent culture along with it. The U.S. government eventually cracked down on the ghost dance. Why? Because they misinterpreted. There were U.S. agents on every reservation, federal government employees whose job was to, take care of relations with that Native American group on that reservation. And one of them sent a now famous telegram to Washington, D.C., saying, bring us help. We need, soldiers out here. The Indians are dancing in the snow and are wild and crazy. So this dance alarmed some Americans, white citizens, thinking that it was some sort of revolutionary dance. It wasn't. It was sort of a desperation, cry of pain in a sense, and delusion, hoping that it was true that their people would come back that had been killed, relatives, etc. But again, misunderstood, misinterpreted by American officials, and this led to military forces being sent out to capture or anybody that was doing the ghost dance and subdue those that were. But one particular group, some again Native Americans were practicing the ghost dance religion on reservations, but sometimes they left the reservation to go out and do it kind of in the wilderness, and this is what caused. Really, in some ways, kind of the culminating event of this series of wars, the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890. One particular Native American leader took a band of followers out into the wilderness off the reservation, which was against the rules, against the law, based, of course, on what the United States said was the law. And this is where a troop of cavalry were sent out to bring them back. They weren't supposed to fight them, but they kind of surrounded them as they all kind of made camp for the night, and in the morning actually tried to disarm them, which turned into a disaster because some of the Native Americans were not wild about being disarmed, and it was one of those situations that happens all too often in history where a shot broke out. We don't know who fired first, but then just for wild and crazy firing began. But the Native Americans took the brunt of it big time because they were more or less surrounded. So the 7th Cavalry, actually Custer's old unit at this point, not hardly anyone, if anyone, from the Custer's Last Stand still around for obvious reasons, but they ended up firing mostly into unarmed Native Americans, women and children, old people. So it wasn't exactly a battle. It really was a massacre. In minutes, over 200 people were killed and wounded. Some were tracked down and killed as they tried to get away. So yet another grisly tale, in many ways depressing tale, about the rough edge of American expansion west. Also, as part of this expansion and conflict, as part of it, comes the Mexican-American War, the American War with Mexico. The president who brought the war about, James K. Polk, took advantage of a disputed border between Texas and Mexico. So Texas and Mexico were in sort of fevered opposition to each other over where the border between the two was. And Polk wanted to start a war with Mexico for various reasons. One reason is he wanted to take California from Mexico. He believed it would be an important addition to the United States, mainly for economic reasons. But he basically provoked a war. by sending troops into the disputed area, hoping that Mexican troops would fire on Americans and killing somebody. He actually needed somebody to be killed on the American side to be able to sell this to the American people as a war that must be fought, because of what happened to our innocent troops. So he was trying to goad Mexico into attacking, which it did, killing and wounding 16. So he could take this back to the U.S. Congress and the public and say, American blood has been shed on American soil. And kind of paraphrasing him, we cannot allow that insult and that tragedy to go, that murder to go unpunished. We must fight. But Americans largely supported the war. There were some politicians and some political leaders, average Americans, that didn't support the war or came to oppose it in time, though it was a pretty one-sided affair in terms of military combat situation, battles. It was still a pretty high casualty war, although most soldiers on the American side that died of diseases and illnesses, not of battlefield wounds. But in the end, the United States prevailed in the war, actually occupied Mexico City and dictated terms to Mexico. The original negotiations were done by this guy, Nicholas Trist, who was President Polk's envoy to Mexico. We'll back to him in a minute. Here are some of the battles that took place between 1845 and 1847. 13,000 Americans died in the end, 11,000 from disease, and approximately 50,000 Mexicans killed in this rather bloody war. So Trist is in Mexico City negotiating, but he didn't negotiate basically the treaty that Polk had wanted and that Polk thought that Trist was going to get out of it. And when he found out that Trist wasn't doing what he wanted, which wasn't aggressive enough for Polk. Polk was actually thinking about taking all of Mexico. I'm not kidding, and declaring it part of the United States. At least a colony, possibly, some more of it becoming states. And Trist was negotiating a treaty that would have taken less from Mexico and eventually did. Polk recalled him, meaning fired him, but Trist was so far away, right? There's no internet in those days and no cell phones, so he had to sort of send word to him by telegram. It took some time, so Trist just acted like he never got the message and just kept negotiating, and ended up signing the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which did take a third to a half of Mexico from Mexico itself, of course, and incorporated it within the United States. So the United States won the war, and as often happens in war, when you win a war, especially if you win it in a fairly one-sided way, you get to take a lot from the other side, lots of money, lots of land, lots of whatever you say of the terms of the treaty are going to be. If you win a war, in a more marginal way, like you sort of barely win the war, then you usually don't get to take that much stuff, because the other side will say, well, we could actually go back out there and fight some more. We're not totally defeated yet. Don't push your luck too much. But this is one of those cases where the United States played hardball, even though Trist, by comparison with what Polk had in mind, was being relatively mild, which isn't saying much. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, you can kind of see the amount of territory taken here in the map on the left. All of the white area, all of it, right? Most or all of modern-day Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, California were part of what became known as the Mexican Cession. That was all the territory lopped off by the treaty and taken by the United States, which of course has controlled it ever since, because all of those are states now, including the state of California. It's easy for us to underappreciate how severe this actually was. All of us that live in California know that California has a Spanish and Mexican past. at least in the general sense. But I think there's a tendency to see this episode in history right here and say, yeah, the land once belonged to Mexico and then was taken by the Americans in this war. Well, it's actually, again, more severe than that. It belonged to Mexico? No, it was Mexico. California didn't just belong to Mexico, it was Mexico. So was Texas. So was Arizona. That's sort of like saying, California belongs to the United States. No, it doesn't belong to the U.S. It is the United States. It's as much part of the United States as is Washington, D.C. So California was as much a part of Mexico as was Mexico City at the time. So when you think of it that way, you realize how much more serious this actually is. The United States taking, again, depending on how you measure it, either a third or half of Mexican territory permanently. By this treaty, says David Potter, writing a classic book partly on this subject, the United States was to acquire an area of more than 500,000 square miles, including what is now California, Nevada, blah, blah, blah. Next to the Louisiana Purchase, which happened in the early 19th century, about 40 years before this, 40 to 50, the largest single addition to the national domain. So Louisiana Purchase in 1803, 1804, the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, and the Mexican Cession coming in 1848, both huge territorial expansions.